The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Wisconsin.
Using beer to teach science? That's exactly what the University of Wisconsin is doing. We'll meet a professor whose class actually learns about microbiology as it creates its own microbrew. That's next, during office hours. Wisconsin has long been famous for being the dairy state, but in the Badger State, brewing beer is also distilled into our culture and a staple of the state's economy. In fact, Wisconsin ranks 9th nationally in the amount of craft breweries per capita. Recently, the art of brewing was introduced to UW students through a class offered in the bacteriology department by Professor John Roll. He's the instructor pioneering the brand new class in beer brewing and fermentation, and he's with us today on Office Hours. John, welcome. So start by telling me how this all came about. Miller Coors made a fairly significant contribution of this brand new beer brewing equipment to the university, and then you developed a class. But how did this all come about?
The relationship between Miller, which was then Miller, not Miller Coors yet, and the university started quite some time ago, actually before I became involved at all. So the previous chair of our department, Glenn Chambliss, of bacteriology, had been talking with them for quite some time before even our building was built. So Kikkoman had donated money to build the fermentation room, and Miller Coors had seen the room was there.
Kikkoman, that's the soy sauce company?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, yep. So they donated the money to build the room, and then the Miller Coors people had some interest in filling some of that space with some brew house equipment. So that was in the works for quite some time, even before the building was built. And so after the building was built, there were a lot of talks going on, and I had done some home brewing myself and had an interest in brewing, and I taught the food microbiology lab course where we did just a typical home brew in there. And so I made myself available for some of the meetings that were going on out of interest. And so in a lot of the meetings, there were people sitting around the table and talking about all the big money exchange things and all that. And when it came down to it, I was the person they turned to actually develop the syllabus for the course and move it on from there.
So, frankly, you hear a class on beer brewing and you think it's everyone dropping in to brew some beer and drink some beer. The fact of the matter is, I'm a political scientist. He wouldn't let me in the class. I don't have the science background, right?
Well, yeah.
I looked at some of the rigorous prerequisites to get in. Tell me a little bit about that.
So we wanted to make sure that the students coming in this class really had a fundamental understanding of the biology and some of the chemistry that goes on. And so as a prerequisite of the course, we have an intro microbiology course. We have 1 semester of organic chemistry and a semester of biochemistry also. So that allows us to go into a lot more of the details of the actual fermentation, and for them to understand some of the chemistry that's going on too. For example, we just had a lecture today on some of the water chemistry and some of the details that happen in the water and some of the concerns about water quality.
So as you're talking, we're seeing some footage from your lab, and so some of our viewers can see a little bit about what it looks like. Take me through, if you will, the process of beer brewing.
Sure.
We just go to our refrigerator and take it out. How does it get to that point?
So there's a difference between the typical home brewing process and the way a large-scale brewery would do it. Home brewing is usually done with extract, where you start with an already existing malt extract. In whole grain brewing, what you do is you start with malted barley. And the process of malting barley is taking raw barley from the field, huge industry in itself. And then you take that raw barley, germinate it just a little bit, and then stop it.
Germinate means?
You put it in some water, let it start to grow just a little bit, and then heat it up and stop it. And that allows some of the enzymes to be produced and to start breaking down some of the starch into the sugars that are then used for the fermentation later on. So once you have that malted barley, that's where the brewer actually first gets it. And from there, they'll crush it, which is not a trivial thing in itself. The crush is critical in determining the quality and how things work later on. Then you mix it with water and form a mash of the crushed malted barley and the water.
And the video we saw.
Yes, that initial part was the mash tun, where you can see the barley kind of turning around.
So we saw a big cauldron,
Yep.
and that was the mash.
That was the mash tun. And during that time, you heat it up to a certain temperature and allow the enzymes to function, break down the starches into more simple sugars. And what temperatures you rest it at is important in determining the quality later on. Then from there, it's moved into what's called a lauter tun. And that is where you begin to filter off the sugar solution from the husks and the remnants of the barley that's in there. So you circulate that through for a little while and form a nice filter bed. That process is called vorlaufing. Then once you get the what's called wort, W-O-R-T, nice and clear, then you begin to drain that off into the brew kettle. So once you get the liquid drained off and you sparge it or you rinse it well with hot water, and move it over in the brew kettle. From there, you boil it for an hour and a half, and that's where the hops are usually added.
I'm gonna jump in here. We got a couple more steps before we have beer, right?
Yep.
A couple more steps before we have beer. We'll get to those steps, tell you a little bit more, tell you a lot more about how beer is brewed when we return on Office Hours.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
For more than 100 years, the University of Wisconsin has been inspired by the Wisconsin idea,
which says the good work of the university extends to the boundaries of the state and beyond.
So the UW works hard to help build Wisconsin's economy.
Educate people of all ages.
Advance health and medicine.
And enhance the quality of life for all of us.
hit it!
The University of Wisconsin-Madison. Forward thinking.
Welcome back to Office Hours. We're discussing bacteriology and beer brewing with Professor John Roll. John, so I interrupted you. You started by telling me the process of beer brewing.
Yep.
Fermentation. Pick up where we left off.
So we'd gone through the mash tun, lauter tun in the brew kettle, boil about an hour and a half, and that's where hops are added. And hops are critical now in the brewing process. They weren't always added in beer, but it was found that they add not only a bitterness and aroma, but also the alpha acids in there. The isomerized alpha acids are very antimicrobial. So that's why beer has been so important in history, is that it's very stable. So once you boil it, usually about an hour and a half, then it's usually dropped down into a whirlpool or some type of a container that just swirls the beer around and allows the precipitated protein and remnants of the hops to settle into the middle. That way you can remove them easily. And then pump that out into a wort chiller to cool it down, because now it's 212 degrees, very hot. You want to get it cooled down so that the yeast won't die when you pitch the yeast or inoculate the yeast into the finished wort. So then you put it into a container, pitch the yeast at a very specific rate, which is usually about 1 million cells per mil per.
So pitch the yeast.
Pitch the yeast. Yep.
Not.
Nope. So yes, to just inoculate the yeast into the fermenter.
I'm sorry. We're political scientists, not real scientists.
No,
when you say inoculate the yeast, what do you mean?
You take the yeast and you put it into the container. Yes.
Okay.
So they're usually pitched at 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato, which is a measure of the density of the sugar of the solution. And from there, you just let Mother Nature take its course and let the fermentation go.
Okay. I want to go in a couple different directions. You mentioned the history of beer brewing and beer, and I want to get to that.
Okay.
But first, you described what sounded to me like a pretty complicated process. What are the lessons of beer brewing, why it makes it a particularly relevant, interesting class to demonstrate other sorts of things to your students?
Well, certainly there is a history of beer and brewing in the state, which certainly brings some interest to it. But the process of brewing beer is very analogous to the process of producing a lot of other types of food, yogurt and cheese and sauerkraut and many other types.
Because fermentation is an issue in all of those?
Fermentation is an issue, yep. Preparation of the substrate for the yeast to ferment, or for the bacteria to ferment, down the road, that's all the common theme. Prepare the substrate for the living organism to ferment, and then allow it to do its thing.
And so many of your students, many of the students in the department are going on to scientific careers in food. And so, tell me a little bit more about what the nitty-gritty of them being able to do this in a real high-quality brewing system can help them when they get out in the real world. Not that the University of Wisconsin is not the real world, but another job.
No. And so what this does is it provides a real hands-on way for the students to get experience of the things they'll actually be doing out in industry. Now, certainly this specific equipment is specific for brewing, but again, it takes the academics of what they've learned in a lecture and transfers it into a hands-on, tangible thing that they can relate to and use later on out in industry, or depending upon what they go into, but they can actually use that.
So they can sit in a lecture, they can learn about the science of fermentation, but then, as we know in everything, doing you learn better. And now we have the opportunity to learn how to do fermentation. The fact that it's beer is great for many reasons, but that in some ways isn't important to the issue at hand here.
Yeah, you're right. So for example, they can take what they learned in Biochemistry 501, where they looked at the process of fermentation and saw the intermediates and things that are kind of thrown off, and different types of chemicals that are thrown off, and then be able to sense them in the final product as a certain flavor or as a certain off flavor, a good flavor. So then that relates directly back to what they learned in that biochemical process, where they memorized the structures and all that, and it didn't make that much sense then. But now they're going, oh, I see that. No, that's what that tastes like. That's what that feels like. So it makes it relevant.
Excellent, excellent. So this sounded like a phenomenally complicated process. So when we come back in our next segment, I want to know how this got discovered 5,000 years ago, when we didn't have a beautiful new building and all this great equipment from Miller Coors. So please come back, join us in office hours, and we'll continue our discussion of beer and beer brewing at University of Wisconsin.
Consider this. There's a public university that consistently ranks among the top in the number of Peace Corps volunteers and in the number of graduates serving as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, whether they are leading corporations or changing the world. The next time you see people doing extraordinary things, they are probably Badgers. The University of Wisconsin-Madison. Forward thinking.
Welcome back to Office Hours. We're talking about beer brewing at the University of Wisconsin and a class on beer brewing at the University of Wisconsin. So John, you took me through the whole process of beer brewing. You took me through what the generalizable lessons are for that, for your students. Sounds pretty complicated. And so it makes me wonder, I've read, I've heard, people say that one of the first reasons why people became civilized is they had to stop and grow wheat and grow barley. How did someone discover beer in the first place? They didn't have a pretty building and lots of equipment like you did.
So first of all, the process, complicated? It's a simple process, but anything you analyze more and more, you learn more and more details about it. So perhaps sounds complicated. Reality is that you're right. This has been going on for thousands of years, before even recorded history. The theory is that...
One of the first recipes is a beer recipe that we have, right?
Yes. Ancient Egyptians have, there's a hieroglyph for brewer, and there's hieroglyphs of brewing recipes. But yeah, the thought is that, when man was nomadic and wandering around, came across a puddle near a grain field and sampled some of it and say, hey, this tastes kind of good, and enjoy that, and maybe I'll come back here. So kept coming back same place, and boy, it's near the grain, maybe I'll grow some grain and go on from there.
So there's some grain lying around. The grain got some moisture somehow.
Sure.
And then...
Natural yeast just contaminated it and fermented it, and next thing you know, you got beer. Or a precursor of beer.
Precursor beer.
Yes.
So if we were to follow the recipe of the ancient Egyptians, we don't know what beer tasted like many thousands of years ago. Would it taste like what we know now to be beer?
Certainly I don't know for sure, but I can tell you that it probably would be different in that they didn't use hops as we typically use hops today. That was introduced in Europe quite a bit after that. They are known to have made quite a few different types of beer, though. So they were pretty elaborate in what they did. And again, this thousands of years ago.
And there were some medicinal effects for beer also for people then, right? We think.
Yeah, perhaps. Certainly the alcohol in the beer played a role in you know, how it made them feel. But there are, again, antimicrobial properties. One of the things that, that has made beer so important, like I mentioned before, is that just in general the pH. It's a very low pH, which makes it a very stable product that can be stored for a long time. And so that makes it very important. One of the stories is that the Mayflower carried a lot of beer, and one of the reasons they stopped when they did is because they were running low on some supplies, and in the diaries it says, and we're running low on beer. We can't go on. Yeah.
So we talked about, you know, different tastes now and back then, but we have a student question. We asked some students some questions about beer. We want to show those to you, and he's going to have a question about different sorts of beer.
Okay.
I'm Brent, a senior, and I was wondering, what's the difference between microbrew beers, craft beers, and beers for mass production?
Yeah, so microbrews and craft brews are kind of the same thing in that they certainly imply a smaller batch, and that allows the brewmaster to cater for a certain taste a little bit more, to maybe cater it towards a certain crowd. The larger brewers are certainly trying to satisfy a much larger audience, and so they don't, just by default, they don't have the luxury of just tweaking things and changing things a little bit here and there to make it a little bit more like this or a little bit more like that. The craft brewers have that opportunity.
But a craft brewer and Miller Coors in Milwaukee and a big brewery, same equipment, same process?
Yeah, same process. They change things to change the flavor of beer. You change the recipe. Whenever you're selling a product to lots of people, if you change that recipe, you might not make some people happy. And so you don't necessarily want to change that. But again, if it's a craft brew, if it's a small brew, you can change it, tweak it a little bit, and it's easy to do. So certainly the Millers, they do have their smaller craft brews that they work on also.
Excellent, excellent. We're going to come back for one more segment of Office Hours. We'll have another student question, and we'll continue our discussion of beer brewing and the importance of beer brewing for education here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Please join us.
Production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Welcome back to Office Hours. We're going to have one more student question, and then we're going to get to even the most fun part of the show. We're going to have John open some beers, taste some beers for us, and give us a hands-on explanation of what we've been talking about. But first, we got one more student question. Let's go to that. Have you answer that.
My name is Eric Sinescu, and I'm a senior. And my question is, I recently saw a commercial for beer that said that it added hops on 3 different occasions. So I was wondering what the advantage is to that.
Hops.
Yes, adding hops is really what gives beer a lot of its flavor. When you add the hops is important for what the characteristics are. So for example, most of the hops that are added early in the brewing process end up providing an alpha acid that's isomerized more and makes more of a bitter taste.
Tell me what that means.
It changes chemical form during the boiling. The hops that are added later in the boil, you tend to retain a lot of the aromatic compounds that give it more of a flavor or smell to it. So those are referred to as aromatic hops. There's yet another process where you can use what's called dry hopping, where after the fermentation or during the fermentation you actually add the hops right to that and let that go from there. So yeah, there are many places you can add the hops, and that's usually a brewery's secret that they want to keep that pretty proprietary.
And you mentioned that hops in the grand history of beer, that's a fairly modern, recent?
Relatively recent. And again, it helps preserve the beer itself.
Let me open a beer for you here. Sure. So it's the Big Ten Network, so we're not going to drink the beer, but we have 3 beers that were brewed by your class, and we will pop it. We got that great sound. And we'll pour it in a Wisconsin Bucky Badger cap here. What's this beer I'm looking at?
So this is an American lager. Typically, now there's many different types of brew styles. The history of brew styles is just immense. What you particularly pay attention to is the color, the aroma, how much hops you get. Do you get malt? Do you smell the hops quite a bit? What type of mouthfeel it gives you? What do you taste first? Do you taste bitterness? Do you taste sweet? How does it finish out in your mouth? How clear it is varies from style to style also. So this is more of an American lager. This one is pale ale, and again, the style determines what type of malted barley you use, and when you add the hops. So this is going to have a different.
If we were comparing these to commercial, well-known beers, this is a pale ale. What would that be for something?
There are a lot of breweries have their own style of pale ale or their own slight variation of a pale ale.
What would be Miller Coors?
Well, yeah, a lot of them. It depends.
Okay.
It depends. Yeah.
Okay. So let me open this. This is a porter.
Yep.
All right.
So and this porter.
I can pour it.
There you go. Sorry.
We're fighting over who gets to pour. Ooh, much darker.
Yes, much darker. In this beer,
almost syrupy.
Yes. In this beer, it's what people refer to as a big beer. The concentration of the sugar before the fermentation is much higher, and the types of malt that you use in here, some of them are actually black malt or chocolate malt, and so that gives a obviously much darker appearance. Sometimes it's not even necessary to filter these beers because you can't see through them anyhow because they're so dark. So it gives a much more full flavor oftentimes, and sometimes the alcohol content is higher because the sugar content was higher. So it's just much more of a hearty beer. We had a taste tester come in, a professional taste tester, and he said that this beer, he said he wouldn't tell us if a beer was bad, but if he said it was a good beer, it's a very good beer. He said this was an excellent beer. It might be award-winning. So we were very proud of that one.
So sadly, we have to go. I thank you. On that note of an excellent beer, maybe we can actually taste it when the cameras are off. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on Office Hours. And please, if you want to see any of our other episodes, you can go to officehours.polisci.wisc.edu. Thanks. Please join us next time on Office Hours.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Wisconsin in association with the Big Ten Network.